Welcome back to our three-part documentary series on D-Day and the Battle of Normandy, America's defining campaign in World War II. In Part 1, The Longest Day begins. We witness extraordinary events of June 6, 1944. American paratroopers jumped into darkness over occupied France. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, scattered across the Norman countryside, fought in small groups to secure vital objectives. At dawn, the greatest amphibious invasion in history struck Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Utah Beach was secured with relatively light casualties. But at Omaha Beach, 2,000 Americans fell in a desperate fight that nearly ended in catastrophe. By nightfall, through individual courage and collective sacrifice, American forces had carved out a fragile beachhead. But D-Day was just the beginning. The beaches were taken, but Normandy had to be won. And what came next would prove even deadlier than the landings themselves. This is Part 2, Breaking Hitler's Atlantic Wall, America's Bloody Advance. Over the next 20 minutes, you'll discover what happened in the crucial days and weeks following D-Day. How American forces pushed inland from the beaches into terrain that favored the defenders. How German counterattacks threatened to drive Americans back into the sea. How American soldiers adapted, innovated, and ultimately prevailed against elite German forces in some of World War II's most brutal fighting. Everything you'll hear comes from authenticated sources: the National World War II Museum, the National Archives, the U.S. Army Center of Military History, and the voices of veterans who fought through the Norman hedgerows. In Part 3 of this series, you'll witness the campaign's climactic battles, the breakout from Normandy, the destruction of German armies, and the road to Paris. But first, you need to understand what American forces faced in the week after D-Day, when victory was anything but certain. Our story continues on June 7, 1944, as American soldiers discovered that taking the beaches was the easy part. The Norman Bocage, ancient farmland divided by hedgerows, became the most formidable obstacle American forces had ever faced. For 1,000 years, Norman farmers had built earthen banks to mark property boundaries and contain livestock. Trees and thick brush grew atop these banks, creating natural walls 10 to 15 feet high and 4 feet thick at the base. The roots created a dense, impenetrable mass stronger than sandbags. Field between hedgerows measured just 200 feet across, some as small as 50 yards. American military intelligence had identified the bocage on maps, but maps showed neat rectangles. They didn't show the reality, a claustrophobic maze where visibility was measured in yards, where every field was a separate fortress, where a squad of German soldiers with a machine gun could hold off an entire company. The terrain nullified every American advantage. American artillery, which had devastated German positions in North Africa and Italy, couldn't see targets hidden behind hedgerows. American tanks, superior to most German armor, became death traps. They couldn't maneuver, couldn't see, and when they tried to climb over hedgerows, they exposed their thin belly armor to German anti-tank weapons. American air power, which had dominated the skies since D-Day, couldn't identify targets in the patchwork of fields and hedges. German defenders, meanwhile, knew exactly how to exploit the terrain. Machine gun teams positioned themselves at hedgerow corners with overlapping fields of fire. Snipers hid in trees. Mortar crews, concealed in one field, dropped shells into adjacent fields without exposing themselves. German tanks and anti-tank guns waited in ambush, invisible until they fired. Worse, the Germans defending Normandy weren't the second-rate coastal garrison troops American intelligence had predicted. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had reinforced the area with elite units. The 352nd Infantry Division, which had nearly thrown Americans off Omaha Beach, was a full-strength combat division. Panzer-Lehr Division, one of Germany's best armored units, moved toward the front. The 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, fanatical and experienced, prepared counterattacks. American soldiers, most in combat for the first time, faced German veterans who'd fought in Russia and North Africa. The learning curve would be steep. The casualties would be devastating. Adolf Hitler had given explicit orders. The Allied invasion must be thrown back into the sea within the first 48 hours, before the beachhead could be reinforced and consolidated. On June 7th and 8th, German forces launched determined counterattacks against the American beachheads. Their objective: drive to the coast, split the American forces, and destroy them piecemeal. The German 352nd Infantry Division, despite being badly mauled on D-Day, struck toward Omaha Beach. American units, still disorganized in the chaotic landings, fought desperate defensive actions. The 115th Infantry Regiment of the 29th Division held the town of Isigny against repeated German assaults. Artillery fire from ships offshore and American field guns broke up German formations, but the attacks kept coming. To the west, near Utah Beach, the situation was even more dangerous. The 91st German Infantry Division counterattacked the 82nd Airborne Division's positions around St. Mire-Église. The paratroopers, scattered on D-Day and still under strength, held the town against tanks and infantry. German artillery pounded American positions. Hand-to-hand fighting occurred in the streets. The most critical point was a gap between Utah and Omaha beaches. The two American beachheads remained separated by 10 miles of German-held territory, including the strategic town of Carentan. German forces controlled this gap, threatening to exploit the separation and attack each beachhead individually. American commanders understood the danger. The beachheads had to link up. Reinforcements and supplies were pouring ashore. Over 300,000 troops would land in the first week. But without a continuous front, the entire invasion remained vulnerable. On June 10th, elements of the 101st Airborne Division and the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment advanced on Carentan. The Germans were waiting. The battle for Carentan would determine whether the American beachheads survived. Carentan was a medieval market town of 4,000 inhabitants, positioned where 4 causeways crossed flooded marshland between Utah and Omaha beaches. Whoever controlled Carentan controlled access between the two American beachheads. The Germans knew this. So did the Americans. The 101st Airborne Division drew the mission. These were the same paratroopers who jumped on D-Day, fought scattered across the countryside, and survived 5 days of continuous combat on minimal sleep and rations. Now they would assault a fortified town defended by the German 6th Parachute Regiment. Elite Fallschirmjäger who'd earned fearsome reputations in Crete and Italy. The approach to Carentan funneled American forces along narrow causeways raised above flooded fields, perfect killing zones. German machine guns, mortars, and artillery turned the causeways into gauntlets of fire. American paratroopers advanced in single file, unable to deploy off the elevated roads, taking casualties with every step. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment led the main assault down the causeway toward Carentan. For hours, his battalion was pinned down by German fire. Men fell wounded into the flooded fields and drowned, weighed down by equipment. Artillery shells exploded among the packed soldiers. Casualties mounted. The advance stalled. Cole made a decision that would earn him the Medal of Honor. Standing fully exposed on the causeway, blowing a whistle, he ordered a bayonet charge directly at the German positions 400 yards ahead. It was an attack method from World War I, seemingly suicidal against modern weapons. But it worked. The sheer audacity of Americans charging across open ground with fixed bayonets shocked the German defenders. Cole's battalion broke through the first defensive line, reaching the outskirts of Carentan by nightfall on June 10th. The next day, the 101st Airborne, reinforced by the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, fought into the town itself. House-to-house combat raged through medieval streets. German paratroopers defended every building. American soldiers used grenades to clear rooms, bazookas to blast through walls, flamethrowers to burn out resistance. By June 12th, Carentan fell to American forces. The 6th German Parachute Regiment withdrew. The gap between Utah and Omaha beaches was closed. The American beachhead became a continuous front 20 miles wide and 10 miles deep. But the Germans weren't finished. The 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division counterattacked immediately, nearly recapturing the town before being driven back by American artillery and reinforcements from the 2nd Armored Division. Carentan cost the 101st Airborne over 400 casualties. But the strategic victory was immense. The beachheads were secure. Now American forces could expand inland. The real fight for Normandy was about to begin. With the beachheads linked, American forces pushed deeper into the Bocage, and the casualties soared. The hedgerow fighting developed a brutal pattern. American infantry would advance toward a hedgerow, taking fire from German positions on the opposite side. Unable to see the enemy, Americans would call for artillery or tank support. Shells would fall. Tanks would fire, often hitting nothing, because German defenders had already withdrawn to the next hedgerow 200 feet away. When American soldiers climbed over the hedgerow to advance, they'd be cut down by fire from positions they couldn't see. Crossing each hedgerow meant casualties. Each field gain cost lives. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards per day. Divisions that should have advanced miles in a week struggled to move a mile. The 90th Infantry Division, in combat for the first time, suffered such heavy casualties and confusion in the Bocage that its commanding general was relieved after just 9 days. The psychological toll was crushing. In the Bocage, soldiers fought enemies they couldn't see. Death came without warning. A sniper's bullet, a mortar round dropping from the sky, a burst of machine gun fire from an unseen position. Men developed what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder at alarming rates. Combat exhaustion, shell shock, breakdowns. Thousands of American soldiers were evacuated for psychological trauma. The physical casualties were staggering. In the month following D-Day, American forces in Normandy suffered over 40,000 casualties, wounded, killed, missing, and captured. That was nearly as many as in the first month of fighting on Omaha Beach, but spread across the entire front. The casualty rate per day was actually higher after D-Day than during the invasion. German defenders, fighting from prepared positions with interior lines of supply and communication, inflicted disproportionate losses. American advantages in artillery, air power, and numbers mattered less in terrain where neither side could see more than 100 yards and where every hedgerow was a fortress. Company commanders, the lieutenants and captains leading men in combat, had life expectancies measured in days. Replacement soldiers arrived from England with minimal combat training and were dead within their first week. Veteran units became shadows of themselves. The 29th Division, which landed on D-Day with 15,000 men, would suffer over 20,000 casualties during the Normandy campaign, meaning every soldier was killed or wounded, on average, more than once as replacements filled the ranks. The Bocage consumed American forces, and yet they continued advancing one bloody field at a time. American forces faced a tactical crisis. The Bocage was killing them. Standard infantry tactics didn't work. Tanks couldn't function. The advance had stalled. German defenders held every advantage. But Americans had something Germans lacked: a culture of innovation and improvisation that encouraged soldiers at every level to find solutions. Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen, Jr., a cab driver from Chicago serving in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, had an idea. He'd watched Sherman tanks try to climb over hedgerows, exposing their vulnerable undersides to German anti-tank fire. He'd seen tanks get stuck on earthen banks, immobilized and helpless. What if tanks could cut through hedgerows instead of climbing over them? Cullen designed a device using steel from German beach obstacles, the very posts and hedgehogs that had been cleared from the landing beaches. Welded to front a Sherman tank like tusks or prongs, these steel teeth could penetrate a hedgerow's earthen bank. Then the tank's weight and power would rip through the vegetation, creating a gap wide enough for the tank to drive through. The device worked brilliantly. Tanks equipped with Cullen cutters, quickly nicknamed Rhino tanks after their horn-like appearance, could smash through hedgerows in seconds, emerging on the other side with guns firing, catching German defenders by surprise instead of exposing themselves on top of hedgerows. The innovation spread rapidly. General Omar Bradley, commanding the First Army, ordered mass production. Within 2 weeks, ordnance units had fabricated thousands of hedgerow cutters. By late June, hundreds of American tanks were equipped with the device. The Rhino tanks transformed Bocage warfare. Combined with new infantry tactics, soldiers advancing closer behind tanks, using the armor as mobile cover, American forces could finally leverage their advantages in firepower and numbers. The stalemate broke. The advance resumed. Cullen's invention came from the bottom up, from a sergeant, not from high command or engineering departments. It epitomized American military culture, pragmatic, innovative, willing to try anything that worked. Cullen received the Legion of Merit for his contribution. More importantly, his device saved countless American lives and helped in the Battle of Normandy. The Germans, despite their tactical excellence, had no equivalent innovation. Their rigid command structure, which excelled at executing plans, struggled to adapt when circumstances changed. Americans adapted constantly. It was a difference that would prove decisive. By late June, American strategy focused on capturing St. Lo, a market town 17 miles inland from Omaha Beach. St. Lo sat at the center of a road network vital to German logistics. More importantly, the terrain south of St. Lo opened into relatively flat farmland, perfect for American armor to maneuver and break out of Bocage. The mission fell to the 29th Infantry Division, the National Guard soldiers from Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania who'd taken brutal casualties on Omaha Beach and fought through 3 weeks of continuous combat. They were exhausted, understrength, and facing the toughest German defenses in Normandy. The approach to St. Lo led to the Vire River Valley, where German artillery on surrounding ridges could devastate any advance. The town itself was heavily fortified. Panzer Lehr Division and the 3rd Parachute Division defended the approaches with mines, obstacles, and interlocking positions. On June 11, the 29th Division began its advance toward St. Lo. Progress was agonizingly slow. German defenders made Americans fight for every hedgerow, every hill, every crossroads. The 116th Infantry Regiment, the Bedford boys who'd been slaughtered on Omaha Beach, attacked Hill 192, a crucial high ground position. The battle lasted days. Men fought yard by yard up slopes covered with mines and barbed wire, under constant artillery fire. By June 18th, the 29th Division had advanced just 6 miles in 1 week. Casualties were devastating. Over 2,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. Entire companies were down to 30 or 40 effectives when they should have had nearly 200. Replacement soldiers arrived, were thrown into combat with minimal integration, and became casualties within days. The weather turned the battlefield into a nightmare. Heavy rains created mud that mired vehicles, flooded foxholes, and made every movement exhausting. Soldiers fought soaked to the skin, sleeping in water-filled holes, their feet rotting from constant wetness, a condition called trench foot that disabled thousands. And still the Germans held St. Lo. General Gerhardt, commanding the 29th Division, pushed his men relentlessly. Some historians would later criticize him for driving the division too hard. But Gerhardt understood the strategic imperative. St. Lo had to fall for the Normandy campaign to succeed. Every day the Germans held the town was another day they could reinforce. Another day the American advance stalled. The 29th Division kept attacking. The casualties kept mounting. And St. Louis church steeple, visible for miles across the battlefield, became the symbol of an objective that seemed impossible to reach. On June 19th, nature intervened with the worst channel storm in 40 years. For 3 days, hurricane-force winds and massive waves battered the Normandy coast. The storm destroyed the American artificial harbor at Omaha Beach. The Mulberry Harbor that had been towed across the channel in sections and assembled to allow ships to unload directly onto the beach. 800 vessels were damaged or destroyed. Hundreds of landing craft were driven ashore and wrecked. The unloading of supplies and reinforcements ceased completely. American forces inland, engaged in heavy combat, suddenly faced critical shortages. Artillery ammunition ran low. Medical supplies dwindled. Food became scarce. Thousands of wounded soldiers awaited evacuation in field hospitals that couldn't evacuate them because no ships could reach the beaches. The storm gave German forces a respite. Reinforcements reached the front. Defensive positions were strengthened. For 72 hours, the advantage shifted back toward the Germans. When the storm finally abated on June 22nd, American logisticians faced a crisis. The Mulberry Harbor at Omaha Beach was destroyed and couldn't be rebuilt. All supplies for the First Army would have to come across the beaches themselves, a slower, more dangerous process. The entire invasion timeline was threatened. But American ingenuity again provided solutions. Engineers improved beach exits. Logistics units developed faster unloading procedures. Navy construction battalions, the Seabees, worked around the clock repairing damaged facilities. Within days, supply flow resumed, though never reaching the levels planners had projected. The storm proved one crucial point. The American beachhead in Normandy, despite setbacks, was permanent. German forces had failed to throw Americans back into the sea during the critical first 2 weeks. The moment for a decisive German counterattack had passed. Now it was a question of American persistence against German defensive skill. And persistence was something Americans had in abundance. The final week of June brought more bloody fighting across the entire American front. The 4th Infantry Division, which had landed at Utah Beach with light casualties, now fought through Bocage toward Cherbourg in the north. The major port city was vital. Until Americans captured a functioning port, all supplies came across open beaches, vulnerable to weather and German attack. The 90th and 82nd Divisions fought toward the key crossroads town of La Haye-du-Puits. The 9th Infantry Division advanced on the western side of the Carentan Peninsula. Every division faced the same enemy, terrain that nullified American advantages and German defenders who made Americans pay in blood for every yard. But the Americans had one overwhelming advantage: replacements. When a German division suffered 50% casualties, it was effectively destroyed. German replacements were scarce, poorly trained, increasingly composed of older men and teenagers pressed into service. When an American division suffered 50% casualties, new soldiers arrived from replacement depots. Units reorganized and the division returned to combat. This was attrition warfare. Americans could afford losses that would cripple German forces. The arithmetic was brutal but simple. American industry produced limitless supplies. American training camps produced endless replacements. American logistics delivered everything to the front. Germany, fighting on multiple fronts, running low on fuel and raw materials, and losing soldiers it couldn't replace, was being ground down. By the end of June, American forces had expanded the beachhead to a line roughly 30 miles wide and 15 miles deep. Over 500,000 American troops were now in Normandy. 400,000 more would arrive in July. The beachhead had become a base for offensive operations. But St. Lo still hadn't fallen. The Bocage still consumed American soldiers. German resistance remained fierce. The breakout that would win the campaign still seemed distant. American commanders planned Operation Cobra, a massive offensive designed to shatter German lines south of St. Lo and break out into open country. But before Cobra could launch, St. Lo itself had to be taken. The 29th Division, now reinforced by the 35th Infantry Division, prepared for a final push. The battle would be the bloodiest of the entire Normandy campaign. 3 weeks after D-Day, American forces had accomplished something extraordinary and paid a terrible price for it. They had turned the desperate beachheads of June 6th into a solid lodgment on the European continent. They had linked Utah and Omaha beaches. They had pushed the Germans back from the coast. They had absorbed German counterattacks and held firm. They had adapted to the Bocage, innovated solutions, and continued advancing when lesser armies would have stalled completely. But the cost was staggering. In 3 weeks, American forces suffered over 50,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, captured. Entire companies were wiped out and rebuilt with replacements. Villages like Bedford, Virginia lost entire generations of young men. The 29th Division earned its nickname 29, let's go, but paid for every yard with blood. The Germans, defending their occupied territory, fought with skill and determination that surprised American commanders who'd expected quick victory. The Bocage proved the perfect defensive terrain. German units, though outnumbered and outgunned, inflicted disproportionate casualties and delayed the American advance far longer than Allied planners had anticipated. Yet the strategic situation was clear. The beachhead had become a base. German forces were being ground down. American strength grew daily. The question was no longer if Americans would break out of Normandy, but when and at what cost. This is where our story reaches its climax. In Part 3 of this documentary series, Victory in Normandy, America's Triumph, you'll discover how American forces finally broke through the German lines, how the 29th Division captured St. Lo in one of World War II's bloodiest battles, how Operation Cobra, the massive offensive south of St. Lo, shattered German defenses and allowed American armor to break out into the open, how German forces were trapped and destroyed in the Falaise pocket, and how American soldiers entered Paris as liberators, fulfilling the promise made on D-Day. Part 3 reveals the Normandy campaign's final month, the breakthrough, the pursuit, and the victory that changed the course of history. The men who fought through the Norman hedgerows called it the worst fighting of the entire war, worse than the Bocage, worse than the race across France. Some veterans said it was worse than the Battle of the Bulge. The week after week grinding attrition, the invisible enemy, the constant casualties, the mud and rain and exhaustion, it broke strong men, but it didn't break the American army. Through courage, innovation, and sheer determination, American forces prevailed. They learned, adapted, and overcame. Watch Part 3 to see how the Battle of Normandy concluded, how American persistence and German desperation collided in the battle for St. Lo, how the breakout transformed the campaign, how Allied forces liberated France. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the final episode. Share this video with anyone who wants to understand the sacrifice that defeated Nazi Germany. The story of Normandy is the story of ordinary Americans who achieved the extraordinary. Their courage deserves to be remembered. Their sacrifice must never be forgotten. Part 3, Victory in Normandy, the conclusion of America's defining campaign in World War II.